Well, I can remember when I was 6 years old and I was involved in quite the game of monkey and monkey catcher, which, as you can imagine, is essentially tag on the playground. And I was playing with my best friend Andrew, who was 2 years older than me, and so that meant he was a lot faster on the playground than I was. On this particular day, he had shimmied up the side ladder and crawled over the monkey bars and got into a tower and was off. And he was a lot faster than me, so I needed to make up some ground. So I went up that side ladder and I went across those monkey bars as fast as I could. Okay? Now, the next thing I remember was a lot of pain and a lot of confusion as to why I was on the ground and why my right arm wouldn't work. Now, my parents knew immediately I'd broken my wrist because there was like this odd shape, sticking up out of my wrist. And they're like, okay, we need to go to the hospital. So they take me to the hospital. I remember sitting in my mom's lap on the way to the hospital, and they're like, Robbie, it's okay. The doctors are gonna make it better. The doctors are gonna fix your wrist. And I remember at 6 years old, I did not care. I was like, Mom, do not take me to the hospital. And I pulled all the tricks out of the bag. And I was like, tried all the manipulative schemes I could. Like, I'll be fine. Like, it's okay. Like, it'll be all right. And apparently, it was pretty transparent because my parents didn't buy any of it, and they took me to the hospital. But I remember on that car ride, there were just two main thoughts that were swirling in my head. One, I had called my own BS, right? I was like, this is not okay. I cannot go on like this with my arm broken. But then the other side of me was just so scared. I was so scared to go through the process of resetting my wrist and the healing process, and I didn't want to pay that price. And I want to ask you tonight, is there something like that that's maybe like that with you? To where you see something that needs to happen, or you see somewhere that you want to go, a place that you want to be, but to get there might cause you to go into some deep and maybe even prolonged pain. Maybe it's a marriage that is stalled out, or there's a place of intimacy and depth and happiness you would like to be, but man, to get there would cause you'd have to drag some demons out of the closet and maybe face the reality that maybe you're not the knight in shining armor that you tell yourself that you are. It could be any number of the monsters in our closet that when we pull them out, we think, man, I don't know if I could do that, because if this guy ever came out into the open, I don't know if I'd have the strength to slay that dragon. And so we stuff it back in the closet and kind of pray that we never have to come to that crossroads where we have to face it head to head. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about that breaking of the bone, and the resetting, the healing, the before and the after. And I want to take a particular angle on it because I want to do it through the lens of the day of the Lord, the future event that is going to happen, the day of the Lord. And I want to look at what we can do here and now in light of what we know is coming in the future. So our text today is going to center on Zephaniah 3, verses 6 through 20, as he describes the day of the Lord and its aftermath. And in it, we're going to see three things that we can do as we prepare for our battles. And I want to anchor this on three separate words, and that is accept, expect, and embrace. So let's go ahead and turn to our text. Zephaniah chapter 3, start with me in verse 6. It says, I destroyed nations. Their walled cities are in ruins. I turned their streets into ruins. No one passes through them. Their cities are desolate. No one lives there. But I thought, certainly you'll respect me. Now you will accept correction. Because if she had done so, her home would not be destroyed by all the punishments I had threatened. But they eagerly sinned in everything they did. And it's here in these first verses we get our first word, accept. Accept what? Accept correction. Why? Because on the day of the Lord, God will judge sin. Now, I realize I haven't taken the time to really set up the idea of the day of the Lord and all of its facets, and I don't think we need to tonight, because if you know anything about the day of the Lord, you know that the word associations with it are decidedly negative, right? There's probably images of fire and destruction, and I'm not here to take away from that, because that's honestly a big part of the day of the Lord. There is that judgment on sin. All the sin in this world and all the sinful systems that we have set up is razed to the ground. It gets wiped away, okay? But also there's this twin idea that's riding right alongside it in these verses, and it's, yes, I judge sin, but we didn't have to be here. We didn't have to be here. Look with me again at verse 7. Because verse 7, God gives us a glimpse into his own mind and motivations. Verse 6, it talks about the judgment that he performs on Israel. But verse 7, it takes a turn. and we get to see the motivations behind what God is doing. It says this, verse 7 says, I thought certainly now you will respect me. Some of your translations say fear me. Now you'll accept correction. Judgment came on Israel because they didn't fear God. They were unresponsive to his correction. That's why I say accept correction as our first point. Israel did not accept God's correction. Therefore, judgment was a necessary response. Now, I have 4 children from the ages of 11 to 3. And when they come home from school, often they go up into the game room and start playing. And over the years, I've gotten pretty good. I can nail it down within about 5 minutes of when someone's about to get hurt. Okay, it's in the laugh, right? It's in the kind of laughter. It's on the kind of thumps and bumps you hear going on upstairs. And usually when that alarm goes off in my head, it's like, okay, we're within 5 minutes of injury. I call all the kids to the top of the stairs. And I say, give me your eyes. 8 eyes on me. And I say, someone's about to get hurt. Change your game. Change your behavior. Because if someone gets hurt, you will be in trouble. Yes, sir? Yes, sir. And they go back to playing. Sometimes they change their behavior. Sometimes they don't. And when they don't, daddy's usually right, and someone gets hurt. Now, after I've addressed the injured child, I go to the 3, and I say, we don't need to be having this conversation right now. If you would have just responded to my correction when I gave it, this is not necessary. I don't need to ground you. I don't need to punish you. I don't want to be here. But you made me come here because you didn't respond to what I said the first time. God is saying the same thing to Israel. I did not want to lay waste to my city. I did not want to punish my people like this, but you did not respond to my correction. And so now we have to have this conversation. Accept correction. The second thing that we can do in light of the coming day of the Lord is this: expect. Expect what? Expect renewal. Why? Because on the day of the Lord, not only will God judge sin, he will also bring about worldwide renewal. Because judgment's not the end of the story with God. Okay? We have a God that renews. Look with me in verse 9. Verse 9, we have verse 8 talks about the full-blown judgment that God is going to give on sin in the world. Verse 9 takes a hard left turn. Read with me verse 9. It says, know for sure that I will then enable the nations to give me acceptable praise. All of them will invoke the Lord's name when they pray, and they will worship him in unison. After the dust had settled, renewal begins. And it's in the next few verses that there's this contrast, this A and B that just goes back and forth, the transition between the old and the new. Okay? So it says, no longer are they going to be arrogant and boastful and prideful on my holy hill. No. I'm going to leave a remnant of meek and humble people. No longer are they going to speak deceitfully. No, they'll speak the truth will be on their lips. No longer will people terrorize them. No, they're going to eat and they're going to graze and lay down like sheep. It's this beautiful transition between the old and the new. And those of us on this side of the New Testament should hear that phrase in the back of our heads: the old things are passed away. Behold, all things are becoming new. So inside this idea, this transition between the old and new, you kind of see the once again 2 prongs of that thought. So there's the repression, or there's the removal of that which is sinful, right? But there's also the establishment and the building up of that which is good. Okay? As an illustration, before I moved to the Metroplex, I lived on some acreage down in Bryan College Station. And the back 2 acres were wooded. There was a creek that was run through it. It was great. Well, it wasn't great. It was an overgrown wreck, is what it was. Okay? But it was my Eden. And I remember over the next few years of moving in, I was like, I'm going to rid this of all signs of the fall. And so I took every thorn and thistle, and I must have pulled out miles of those long barbed thorns that go up and choke your tree. I pulled out miles. I had a perpetual burn pile that was just always throwing in the junk in that pile. And by the time I was finished with it, I had an oriental bridge over. I mean, it was gorgeous. I loved it because I got to choose which tree, die. There, that'll give this tree room to grow. And I was like, okay, I'll have a bluebonnet hill right here. I got to sculpt it. And it's like, that's going to be my heaven, boys. I'm just telling you. God's going to give me an overgrown wreck of woods. He says, Rob, go. And I'm going to be like, yes, let me edit. So I got to do that. But in a way, I mean, that was the hardest part about leaving, honestly, is that land ministered to us so deeply. And in a way, I got to renew that land. I got to take out that which was cancerous and destructive and choking. And I made space for and established that which was good and added to the value of the land. So we expect renewal. Expect renewal. Now, the final word that I want to hinge us on today is this: embrace. Embrace what? Embrace God's presence. Why? Because on that day, God will once again dwell with his people. In the text that we're about to read, the presence of God becomes the crowning jewel of this next section. Read with me. We're going to read verses 14 to 17 together. If you still have your bookmark from our previous sermon, which should be very familiar material, right? It says, "Shout for joy, daughter Zion. Shout out, Israel. Be happy and boast with all of your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has removed the judgment against you. He has turned back your enemy. Israel's king, the Lord, is in your midst. No longer do you need to fear disaster. On that day, they'll say to Jerusalem, 'Don't be afraid, Zion. Your hands must not be paralyzed from panic. The Lord, your God, is in your midst. He is a warrior who can deliver. He takes great delight in you, and he renews you by his love. He shouts for joy over you.'" Now, I know on this side of the cross, this side of Pentecost, God forgive us, the thought of God being with you can be a little anticlimactic, don't you think? Mm-hmm. You know, we say, it's okay, you might be going through terrible things. God is with you. Vaya con Dios. As if that solves all the problems, right? But to the original audience of that, to the original audience, God's presence being with you was anything but anticlimactic. Mm-hmm. Because if you had God's presence with you, you had everything else that went with it. That means you had his joy, you had his love, you had his protection, you had his peace, you had his shalom. You had him, and so you had everything. Now, in the verses we just read, if we could kind of extrapolate a word out of that, something that comes with the presence of God in our life, it's this: joy. Joy. Because the presence of God brings great joy. But not only that, I want us to see another verse that with the presence of God comes transformation. Transformation. Skip down to the last verse of that book. Skip down to the last verse. It's at verse 20. Final verse says, "At that time I will lead you. At the time I will gather you together. Be sure of this: I will make all the nations of the earth respect and admire you when you see me restore you, says the Lord." When you see me restore you as the centerpiece of the earth, God's presence brings with it transformation. He will transform his city and his people into a place that is befitting of his perfection, his beauty, and his holiness. If you remember in Genesis chapter 2, when it talks about God making a garden for them, and then he nuached them inside it, he rested them inside it, God is doing the same thing with his throne. He sees his Jerusalem, his city, his people. He's got to make it appropriate for him. And then he will nuach, he will rest inside his holy temple. Okay? It'd be the same for us. Imagine like taking a garbage bin full of like McDonald's trash and dumping it on your bed. And then saying, go take a nap. No, you're not going to do that. You're going to rid it of the trash. You rip your sheets off, either burn them or wash them on extra hot several times, and you would make yourself a place that's inviting for you and appropriate for you to sleep in. Does that make sense? God is doing the same thing. He is transforming what is around him. But without that transformation, God cannot settle in. His presence cannot be there. The great sequoias in the western United States are the largest species of tree in the world. Okay? And as we incorporated them into the national forest, we realized after several years of keeping forest fires down that there were no little seedlings of sequoias. And the answer into that being, we found out, is because the seed pods that are up in the tops of the trees, they need forest fire in order for them to constrict and release their seeds. And those seeds fall on the exact kind of ash and mineral soil that's appropriate for them to germinate. And then they need the winter snow. And then they need the warm spring rain. All of those conditions have to be perfect in order for the sequoias to propagate. Without those conditions present, one of the smallest seeds cannot turn and transform into one of the largest trees on our earth. And God's transforming presence is something that I don't think we need to keep relegated to the far and distant future. God's transforming presence is here now. We embrace God's presence now. We can accept God's presence. We can accept God's correction now. We can expect his renewal now. And we can embrace his presence now. Already. But not yet. Now, as you can see, my wrist is fully functional except for a few pops and grinds. But it experiences a freedom of movement that never would have been possible in its broken state. Okay? And I believe our lives and the entire world are just like that. Though the day of the Lord has not yet come in its full sense, in the coming of Christ's kingdom here on earth, today we can still apply these principles of accepting God's correction, of expecting his renewal, and embracing his presence in our lives